Welcome to the deep dive. If you've ever wondered how to really light a fire under students who are struggling with learning to get them truly motivated to achieve, well, you're in the right place.
Mhm.
We spent some serious time digging through the research, 20 different studies, in fact, all focused on something called attribution training.
Yeah.
These studies looked at kids from kindergarten all the way through high school who face various learning challenges in their schoolwork. Our mission today is pretty simple: to figure out, based on this research, what actually makes attribution training work in the classroom for you and your students.
That's right. And the key idea behind all of this is attribution theory. It really boils down to this. What students believe are the reasons for their successes and failures. It has a massive impact on whether they'll even, want to try again.
Mm.
Think about it. If the student believes they bombed a test because they're just not smart enough, it's hard to imagine them feeling pumped to study harder next time.
Okay, so let's get a handle on this maladaptive attributional style. It keeps popping up in the research, and it sounds like a major roadblock for students who aren't achieving their potential. What exactly is it?
Well, it's a pattern of thinking where students tend to blame their failures on things they see as stable and internal, like, just not being good at something.
Right, like it's fixed.
Exactly. Then, when they do manage to succeed, they might just chalk it up to luck or some other external factor that they don't really control.
Hmm.
The really damaging part is that this can lead to them feeling like their own effort just doesn't matter, that it won't change the outcome anyway.
So attribution training is designed to help them break out of that way of thinking.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The goal is to guide students to see that their failures are often due to things they can influence, like maybe they didn't try hard enough or they didn't use the best approach.
Mm-hmm.
If they start to believe they have some control over why they're not succeeding, they're much more likely to feel motivated to put in more effort or try different strategies in the future.
That sounds like a pretty fundamental shift in perspective. What are the main things we're hoping to see happen with this kind of training?
Well, the research points to a few key goals. First, we want students to focus on the task at hand rather than getting, hung up on the fear of failure.
Okay.
Second, when they inevitably experience setbacks, we want them to move away from just giving up and instead start thinking about, okay, what went wrong and how could they approach it differently?
Problem solving.
Right. And third, it's about helping them see that failure isn't necessarily about a lack of intelligence, but more often about things like insufficient effort or maybe needing a better strategy.
It's about empowering them to see themselves as agents in their own learning. Now, these studies we looked at, who were the students involved and what kind of training did they actually receive? Was it pretty uniform?
Actually, the range of students was quite broad, which I think gives us a more comprehensive picture. The studies included kids from age 6 all the way to 18 who had been identified with various learning difficulties.
Wow, 6 to 18.
Yeah, specific learning disabilities, mild to moderate intellectual disabilities, those who were underachieving, students exhibiting learned helplessness, and those already showing these negative attribution patterns we've been discussing.
Okay.
The common thread, though, was that the attribution training was specifically aimed at improving their performance in academic areas.
And it wasn't just general pep talks, was it? The training was actually connected to what they were learning in school.
That's a really important point.
Yeah.
These weren't just generic "you can do it" speeches.
Mhm.
The training was always tied to their actual experiences of success or failure in academic tasks.
Sure.
This direct link to their schoolwork is what makes this research particularly relevant for, educators listening.
Okay, that gives us a really good foundation. Now let's get into the core of the findings. What factors did these 20 studies look at to see if attribution training was actually making a difference?
Here's where it gets really interesting. There wasn't like one single magic ingredient that guaranteed success.
Ah, figures.
Yeah, but when we looked at all the studies together, some fascinating patterns started to emerge that can give you some real insights.
Such as, let's start with the students themselves. Did things like the specific learning challenge they faced or their age seem to play a big role in whether the training worked?
Surprisingly, not really. The studies used all sorts of ways to describe the students' specific diagnoses like dyslexia, broader ideas like learned helplessness, even just teachers saying they weren't reaching their potential.
Hmm.
But we didn't find a clear connection between any one of these descriptions and how successful the attribution training was.
Interesting.
Age-wise, most of the studies focused on elementary and middle school students, and again, there weren't big differences in success between those two groups. One thing that does stand out, though, is the lack of research with high school students.
Yeah, that's a big gap.
Definitely.
Even then.
Motivation is obviously a huge issue there, too.
Absolutely. What about the subject matter itself? Were there certain subjects where attribution training seemed to be more effective, like math versus reading?
The studies covered a lot of different academic areas. Reading, math, puzzles, memory tasks, even using memory strategies like mnemonics.
Okay.
And importantly, the training often focused on their beliefs about why they succeeded or failed in that specific subject. But just like with the student characteristics, we didn't see a clear pattern of success tied to any particular subject.
Okay, so it seems like the specific student or the specific subject wasn't the main factor. What about the training itself? Things like how long it lasted.
Well, the length of the training varied quite a bit. Some studies were as short as 3 days, others went for a whole 12-week school term.
Wow, big range.
Yeah. And here's something that might surprise you. It seemed like the shorter training periods were actually more effective at increasing how long students would stick with a task and their tendency to attribute outcomes to their effort.
Shorter being better. That's not what you might expect. Why do you think that might be?
That's a strong possibility. It could be that shorter, more focused sessions are just easier to implement well, maybe have a more immediate impact.
Yeah.
It could also be that with longer interventions, maybe the message gets diluted or other classroom factors start to have a bigger influence over time. We also noticed a link with group size.
Oh, okay.
Studies that weren't as successful often involved training entire classrooms, which also tended to be longer in duration, so it's a bit hard to separate those two things completely.
Right.
But for teachers listening, this could suggest that maybe targeted, brief interventions might be more impactful than long, drawn-out programs when you're focusing specifically on attribution.
Large groups versus smaller groups, that feels like a really important practical point for teachers to consider.
Absolutely. The research really points to a negative relationship between large group sizes and the success of attribution training. Most of the studies that didn't show positive results were done with whole classes.
Yeah, I can see that.
It's just much harder to personalize the feedback
Yeah.
and make sure individual students are really taking the messages to heart in a larger group setting.
Makes sense. And who was actually delivering this training in the studies? Was it usually the teachers themselves?
Interestingly, in the vast majority of these 20 studies, the training was given by the researchers, or research assistants, or experimenters.
Oh, okay.
Only a few studies involved classroom teachers directly, and unfortunately, the results in those teacher-led studies were more mixed.
Mixed how?
Well, some did see students sticking to tasks longer, which is good, but not necessarily a change in how they explained their successes and failures in terms of effort.
So the core attribution didn't shift as much.
Right. One study did have success using student tutors who were trained to give attributional feedback, which is kind of an interesting model for educators to think about.
Peer tutoring, huh?
Yeah.
Interesting. So it seems like teacher involvement is a key area where we need more understanding to really bridge the gap between what works in research settings and what's feasible and effective in real classrooms.
Definitely.
What about the specific kind of explanations, the attributions that were being encouraged? Did that change over the course of the research?
Yes, it definitely evolved. Early on, the focus was often almost entirely on effort, encouraging students to see that if they failed, it's because they didn't try hard enough.
Right, the try harder message.
Exactly. But the research expanded to also include explanations related to ability and, increasingly, to the use of effective strategies.
Okay.
What's fascinating is that no single set of attributions proved to be the absolute best. However, the trend toward including strategy-focused attributions seems particularly important
Why is that?
because it gives students a concrete, controllable thing they can actually work on. It's not just try harder, but try this strategy.
That makes sense. Effort is crucial, but if you're putting in effort and still not getting the results you want, focusing on strategy gives you another lever to pull, another way to approach the problem.
Precisely.
And were there specific methods or tools that seemed to be particularly effective for delivering this training, like computers or videos?
The researchers used a real mix of methods. Simple things like using colored lights to signal right or wrong answers, to role-playing activities, audio and video recordings, and even computer-based programs. And again, no single method stood out as being significantly better than the others.
Huh.
It really seems that the content of the attributional messages, focusing on those controllable factors like effort and strategy, was more important than the specific way it was delivered.
So the what of the message seems more crucial than the how of delivery.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Okay, so the message itself is key. Now, the research also talks about direct versus indirect ways of approaching attribution training. Can you explain what those mean for us?
Sure. These terms basically describe two different ways of helping students think about their successes and failures. A direct approach involves actively getting students to say out loud or maybe just to themselves why they think they did well or struggled.
Okay, like asking them directly.
Yeah, they might be asked, why do you think you got this right? Or something like that. The indirect approach is more about adults, teachers, or researchers giving feedback that frames the outcomes in terms of specific attributions.
So the adult provides the explanation.
Right. For example, a teacher might say, you solved that problem because you really focused and tried hard.
Gotcha.
While the research didn't find a huge definitive difference between the two overall, there was a tendency suggesting that direct approaches might be a bit more effective.
Why do you think that is?
Well, think of it this way. An indirect approach is maybe like a teacher saying to the whole class, you all did great because you worked hard. While a direct approach might involve asking a student individually, why do you think you got this right? And guiding them specifically to attribute it to their effort or strategy.
That distinction makes it much clearer. Getting the student to actively engage with their own explanations seems more likely to lead to them really internalizing those beliefs.
Exactly. And one of the researchers even cautioned against relying too much on indirect methods because, the teacher's interpretation of why a student made a mistake might not match the student's own understanding,
Good point.
potentially leading to them not really connecting with the feedback.
Yeah. Okay, we've covered a lot of the different variables.
Mhm.
Now let's dig into some actual examples of these attribution training interventions and see what they look like in practice. Let's start with those indirect approaches that focus mainly on effort as the main explanation.
Right. So the simplest of these were basically the try harder messages,
Yeah.
often used when a student didn't succeed. Dweck's early work back in 1975 showed some positive effects. Students persisted longer on tasks and tended to attribute outcomes more to effort.
Okay, so some initial promise.
Yeah, but then another group of researchers, Kennelly and colleagues, used slightly different wording, blaming failure on a lack of trying in more controlled lab settings, and they didn't see the same positive results.
Subtle difference in wording, different outcome.
Exactly. And then when this idea of adults just encouraging effort was tried in actual classrooms, one study by Flaum and Pasquarella didn't find any improvements either. So across several of these initial studies, it seems the simple act of telling students to try harder, or even linking their successes just to effort, might not be enough to fundamentally shift their underlying beliefs about why they succeed or fail.
So just telling someone to try harder isn't a magic bullet. Probably lacks the specific guidance,
Yeah.
right, and understanding of why they might be struggling.
Precisely.
Yeah.
So some studies then shifted to giving effort-based feedback for both successes and failures.
Okay, how did that look?
For instance, Chapin and Dick, and later Meyer and Dick, had proctors say things like, that was very good, that means you tried, after a correct answer.
Right.
And no, you didn't get that, that means you should have tried harder after an incorrect one. These studies, done in experimental settings, did show that when adults provided this kind of feedback, students tended to stick with tasks longer.
I think one of the researchers, Kennelly, raised a good point about that, didn't he? Suggesting that praising success might just be making them feel good about getting it right, rather than actually changing their beliefs about why they got it right in terms of effort.
That's a very valid concern. It's really hard to know for sure if the feedback is truly changing their attributions or just reinforcing the positive feeling of the outcome. Then we saw Kraski's work that used video modeling, someone on video trying hard on puzzles. Interestingly, they found that this led to female students trying harder on their own.
Just the girls.
Yeah, but it didn't have the same effect on the male students. The reasons behind that gender difference weren't really clear from the study.
Huh, curious. Video modeling seems like an interesting way to show effort in action, though. And what about using technology to deliver these kinds of messages?
Yeah, Okolo's study used computer-based math problems that gave students feedback related to effort.
Okay.
When they got an answer right, it sometimes included statements about ability, too, like, you're good at this.
Okay.
When they got it wrong, it would say things like, you can get it if you keep trying, and you can do better if you try harder.
And did that work?
Well, interestingly, even though students spent more time working on the math problems, they persisted longer. Their actual beliefs about whether effort made a difference didn't really change much.
Ah. So, more time on task, but not necessarily a deeper shift in thinking.
Exactly. It really highlights the complexity of this.
Yeah?
Increased effort on the task doesn't automatically mean a fundamental shift in how they explain their outcomes.
That's a really important distinction to keep in mind. Okay, now let's move on to indirect approaches that tried to combine effort with ability attributions. What was the thinking behind including ability?
Well, the idea here is that feeling capable, feeling smart, is also a source of pride, right?
Sure.
And some research suggests that students might actually prefer to be seen as smart rather than just hard workers. Plus, there's a potential risk with focusing only on effort.
What's that?
Well, a student might start to think, if the teacher keeps telling me I need to try harder, it must be because they think I'm not very good at this. You don't want to inadvertently reinforce a belief in low ability.
That makes a lot of sense. You want to acknowledge their potential as well. So how did these combined approaches work in practice?
Craven and colleagues did a study comparing attributional feedback given by researchers with feedback given by the students' own teachers.
Okay.
Both groups were supposed to alternate between giving ability and effort attributions. When students succeeded, like, you got that right, you're good at this, or you got that right, you tried hard, and then focus on effort when they failed.
Yeah.
You have the ability, you'll do well when you try harder.
And how did it go, especially with the teachers?
Well, the study found that the teachers had a really hard time sticking to the planned feedback consistently in the busy classroom.
Hmm.
And managing a whole class, less one-on-one time.
Yeah, the reality of teaching.
Exactly. So while the students who received feedback from the researchers showed some small improvements, the classroom implementation wasn't very effective. It really underscores those challenges of translating research protocols into the classroom.
It really does highlight the practical difficulties. But there was a study that had more success with this combined approach, right? The one that used peer tutoring.
Yes, Yasutaka and colleagues.
Yeah.
They had older students with learning disabilities tutor younger students who also had learning disabilities.
Okay.
The tutors got training each week on how to give specific attributional feedback. When the younger students got something right, the tutors were trained to say things that attributed it to either effort or ability. You're really putting a lot of effort into this, or you're really very smart.
One for failure.
When they got something wrong, the tutors were told to focus on effort or suggest a strategy like try sounding out the word or let's try going one by one.
Interesting. And that worked better.
Yeah, this study was interesting because it found that this combination of strategy guidance and effortability feedback actually improved how competent both the tutors and the students they were helping felt. That peer-to-peer element seemed to be a key factor.
That's a really interesting model, leveraging the power of peer interaction. It suggests that who is delivering the attributional feedback can also make a difference. Okay, now let's switch gears again and talk about those direct approaches where students are more actively involved in stating the reasons for their performance.
Right. These approaches often started with teachers or researchers giving some initial instruction and feedback, but then they'd incorporate ways for students to use self-talk or maybe choose their own explanations.
Okay.
Thomas and Pashley had teachers model effort-based self-statements, things the teacher would say to themselves, and then have the students practice saying them.
Like role-playing.
Sort of, yeah. They did see students stick with puzzles for longer, but again, it didn't lead to a significant increase in the students actually attributing their outcomes to effort. The teacher script focused on the idea of learning to be a better worker by saying the right things to yourself, especially when tasks got difficult.
So modeling and rehearsal alone weren't quite enough to shift those underlying beliefs about effort.
It seems like just saying the words isn't enough. They need to really believe them, right?
Right.
However, other studies using audio recordings of children making effort attributions had more success. Fowler and Peterson and Shelton and colleagues used tapes of kids saying things like, I got that right, that means I tried hard, when they succeeded.
Okay.
And even if I make a mistake, I can go back and try a little harder, when they didn't.
And what did the students listening do?
The students listening to these tapes were encouraged to repeat the statements out loud, then maybe in a whisper, and eventually silently to themselves until it became more automatic.
Internalizing it.
Yeah. And they were also reminded to use these self-statements when they work on their own tasks. That more active engagement, moving from just listening to internalizing and repeating, seemed to be more impactful.
That makes sense. It's like they're taking ownership of those explanations.
Exactly. And Kraski's math game study took a slightly different direct route. After each math problem, students were told if they were right or wrong, and then they had to choose why they thought they performed that way from a list of options.
They chose their own attribution?
Yeah. The options included things like luck, how hard the problem was, their own effort, and their ability, both good and bad ability attributions. If they chose effort as the reason, that was reinforced. If they didn't, the experimenter would try to gently guide them towards thinking about effort as a contributing factor.
And how did that go?
This approach was particularly encouraging for students who tended to feel helpless, the learned helplessness pattern. It helped them attribute their outcomes more to effort and less to a lack of ability. Giving students that agency to select their own attributions, even with some guidance, seems like a powerful way to promote self-awareness and ownership.
Absolutely. Now, the research also explored the idea of combining strategy instruction with attribution training. That sounds like it could be a really powerful combination, teaching them how to succeed and also why they are succeeding.
Yeah, many researchers initially thought that this combination would be very effective. The idea being that teaching students how to learn through strategies and why they succeed or fail through attributions would create a really strong impact.
Makes intuitive sense.
Right. And early reviews by Borkowski and others supported this idea, especially in the area of reading comprehension for students with learning disabilities.
What did these combined interventions usually involve? How did they actually mix the two?
Well, they often involved teachers explicitly teaching reading strategies, but they would also intentionally make mistakes sometimes while demonstrating.
Oh, modeling failure.
Yeah, exactly. To show students how to respond to failure. They would then discuss why the mistake happened, emphasizing things they could control, like maybe not using the strategy correctly or not putting in enough effort.
Okay.
They would also model positive self-talk related to effort while demonstrating the strategy. Some researchers even use things like cartoon characters with captions.
Cartoons. Tell me more.
Yeah, they were designed to visually reinforce the ideas. For example, one cartoon might show a happy student with a good grade and captions like, 2 reasons students do well. 1, they have a good way to remember. 2, they try hard to use it.
Ah, okay, making that link explicit.
Right. And another might show a sad student with a bad grade and captions like, 2 reasons students don't do well. 1, they don't have a good way to remember. 2, they don't try hard to use it. Some researchers even provided teachers with specific steps, like a checklist, for how to weave attribution training into their regular strategy instruction.
That really helps to visualize how these two components could work together in the classroom. But the research findings on this combination weren't always consistently positive, were they? You mentioned some conflicting results.
You're right. Later studies by Miranda and colleagues, as well as Folk and others, didn't always show a clear advantage of combining attribution training with strategy instruction.
Why not?
Well, one study even found that just teaching students self-regulation strategies for reading improved their attributions over time, even without any explicit attribution training.
Interesting. So the strategy itself helped change their beliefs.
It made the researchers wonder if the attribution component was always necessary, or maybe redundant in some cases. Another study found no extra benefit from attribution training when teaching students memory strategies. It's possible that when a strategy is clearly effective, the link between using it and seeing positive results is so obvious.
That the student figures it out anyway.
Exactly. Or that as students experience success with the strategies, their beliefs about why they're succeeding naturally start to shift anyway. That's an important nuance for teachers to consider.
That's a really important point. It suggests that maybe we need to think carefully about when explicitly focusing on attributions alongside strategy instruction is most beneficial. What about using the student's own experiences as a way to highlight this link between strategy, effort, and success?
Some of the more recent and promising studies, like those by Chan and Turner and colleagues, did exactly that.
How so?
Turner's study with students who had mild to moderate intellectual disabilities had them compare how well they could remember something when they didn't try very hard the first time versus when they really focused and tried harder the second time.
Ah, a direct comparison within the student.
Right. Seeing their own improvement firsthand really emphasized how much control they had through their effort. And Chan's work with struggling 7th grade readers in small groups has students practice using reading strategies and then rehearse self-statements that specifically credited their success to using those strategies. I did well because I used the summarizing strategy.
Okay.
Both of these studies showed positive changes in both how well the students used the strategies and in their beliefs about why they were succeeding. So, shifting the focus from external models to the student's own experience of effort leading to success seems particularly impactful.
It really brings it home for them when they can see the direct connection themselves. Okay, now, as we start to wrap up our deep dive into these 20 studies, it's clear that while attribution training has potential, there are some really important things to think about, especially when it comes to making it work in the practical setting of a classroom.
Absolutely. One key issue that came up, and it's a developmental one, is the way children's understanding of ability and effort changes as they get older.
Right, you mentioned that.
Yeah. After around age 7 or so, they start to realize that if someone has to work really, really hard at something, it might mean they're not naturally as good at it, that inverse relationship.
Hmm.
This means that constantly emphasizing effort for students who are low achieving could unintentionally make them feel like they lack ability if they're still struggling, even when they try their hardest. We need to be really careful not to send the wrong message, however unintentionally.
That's a really crucial point. We definitely want to avoid inadvertently undermining their confidence. What other practical challenges did the research highlight for teachers wanting to use attribution training?
Well, as we touched on earlier, the studies that were done in actual classrooms often reported that teachers found it difficult to implement the attribution training consistently as it was designed in the research.
Why was that?
Teachers mentioned, not having enough time, questioning whether it was the most effective use of their limited teaching time compared to other things they could be doing.
Right, the opportunity cost.
Exactly. There were also concerns about how believable it was to constantly praise effort when maybe a student wasn't showing much effort. And even some reports of negative reactions from students who weren't the focus of the attribution training, like maybe feeling left out or judged.
Oh, interesting side effect.
Yeah. So it's not just about what to say, but also when, how, and to whom it's said within the complex dynamics of a whole classroom.
It's a reminder that classrooms are complex ecosystems, aren't they? And what works in a controlled research setting might not always translate smoothly. And what about the research itself? Were there any difficulties in studying attribution training effectively in classroom settings?
Definitely. Researchers pointed out that it's hard to create really realistic classroom situations in a controlled lab setting, but then it's also challenging to keep track of all the different things that are happening in a real classroom when you're trying to study just one specific intervention.
Controlling variables is tough.
Very tough. And measuring the long-term effects of attribution training and whether it actually helps students in other subjects or transfers over time has also been difficult to do well in research.
So, given all of these different pieces of the puzzle, the potential benefits, the practical challenges, the research limitations, what are the main things we should take away from this deep dive into 20 attribution training studies? Is it something that teachers should consider using with their students who are struggling?
Well, I think the big picture is that while attribution training can be helpful, it's definitely not a simple fix for every student. And it really needs to be implemented thoughtfully, especially in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
The research shows some promising results for sure, but its effectiveness depends on a lot of different factors and really requires a careful and nuanced approach. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Okay, so based on all of this, what would be your top 5 key recommendations for educators who are thinking about using attribution training with their students to boost their motivation? What should they keep in mind?
Okay, based on what we've learned from these studies, here are 5 key recommendations I'd offer for you listening. First, and this is crucial, make sure your students actually have the basic skills they need to succeed at a task before you start heavily emphasizing effort.
Right. Don't set them up for failure.
Exactly. If they're genuinely struggling with the underlying concepts, constantly telling them to just try harder might backfire and reinforce feelings of inadequacy. Focus on accurate explanations for their performance.
Okay, number 1, ensure prerequisite skills. What's next?
Second, when students do succeed, encourage them to attribute that success, at least partly, to the strategies they used.
Ah, the strategy link.
Yes. This not only connects their effort to positive outcomes, but also gives them a sense of control. And it can protect their self-esteem. If they experience failure, later on they can think about needing a different strategy rather than just blaming their ability.
Makes sense. Strategy as a buffer. Okay, third.
Third, Think about combining attribution training with strategy instruction most intentionally when the connection between using a specific strategy and achieving success isn't immediately obvious to the student.
So not always needed.
Maybe not.
Yeah.
If the strategy's effectiveness is super clear, you might not need to layer on explicit attribution training quite so heavily.
Got it. Be strategic about combining them. Number 4.
Fourth, prioritize direct approaches that actively involve students in thinking about and verbalizing the reasons for their performance. Things like using self-talk or having them choose from different explanations.
More student involvement.
Right. Also, consider using examples of other students, maybe themselves in the past, or peers who have succeeded through effort and strategy. Be cautious about relying too heavily on just giving general feedback yourself, that indirect approach.
Okay. Favor direct methods and models. And finally, number 5.
And finally, number 5. Be careful when using attribution training with large groups or giving very public feedback about individual students' effort or ability.
Why is that?
Well, it can be embarrassing for the student, and as we mentioned, it might have unintended negative effects on other students listening in. Private conversations or encouraging individual self-reflection are generally safer and more effective.
Those are incredibly valuable and practical recommendations, drawing directly from the wealth of information we've explored today. So, as we wrap up this deep dive, here's a final thought for you, our listener. Considering all the intricacies and conditions for successful attribution training that we've discussed, the importance of timing, the focus on strategy, the direct versus indirect methods, the group size issues, how can educators best identify which students would truly benefit most from this approach? And how can they thoughtfully weave these principles into their already demanding classroom routines without feeling like it's just one more thing to add to the pile? It's a question to really consider as you think about the best ways to support the motivation and achievement of all the learners you work with. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.